Hi, I'm National Master Phil Crocker and welcome to the first of 3 videos looking at double pawns. Double pawns, at least the way I've been brought up in a chess sense, have a kind of sinister reputation. They're usually considered to be a bad thing. What we're going to look at here though is we're going to split them in a slightly unusual way and then work out what is good, what is bad, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to look at 14 different possible ways you can get a double pawn. That's in terms of which file the pawn moves from and which file the pawn moves to. So if you think there's 8 different pawns and most of them can move in 2 different ways for capturing, that will give you 16. But the ones which are rook's pawns can actually only capture in one way each, so that reduces 16 down to 14 types. For these examples I've chosen cases reasonably straight from the opening where black in each case incurs double pawns. That should make it a little more comparable across the different types. So the screen shows the 14 different positions we'll look at on this video, and on the remaining 2 videos we'll have a quick look at a couple of games looking at how you might play with double pawns, and then some examples of how you might play against double pawns. Quick look at advantages from a theoretical point of view. So double pawns, if your pawns are doubled, then you get an extra open file to work with, which can be very useful for a piece like a rook. The pawn which is double might influence a very important square, and in some cases, particularly when a rook's pawn captures inwards, then your pawns as an entire mass may be easier to defend because they're spread across fewer files. And then finally, in some cases you may gain from the exchange which causes the double pawn. So in many cases white in these examples might take a knight with a bishop, and you might judge that in the resulting position it's quite nice to have an extra bishop yourself. So those are advantages. Disadvantages, I mean, I think people often think that yes, double pawns, yeah, let's just attack those and win them, and that might happen, but in my experience it doesn't happen as often as you might think. Perhaps more critically, when pawns are doubled, then some of the squares nearby may be left weak by the exchange that's happened, and because you've got 2 pawns on the same file, then often the mobility of the pawns in total can be less. And in some cases, in an endgame, if you have double pawns, then you may not be able to create a pass pawn, and if your opponent doesn't have double pawns, then they may be able to create a pass pawn, and in a few cases this could be actually a winning advantage. And then finally, maybe a slightly odd thought, but it may actually be easier to swap off double pawns, that they're less mobile, so they're less able to dodge an offer of exchange. And one of the ways you might exploit double pawns is actually to swap them off. Seems a bit odd if they're generally seen as a bad thing, but sometimes by leveraging open a file you can gain more just by exchanging the double pawn. So that's the theory of it all. We will finally look at the performance here, and what I looked at for the 14 different positions that we'll be looking at is the performance on what we're calling the Masters DB, the Masters database on Lichess, and next to that on the right hand side of it, the Lichess database. That's all the kind of blitz and bullet games that are played on Lichess, and then in the final column I've put the white edge, the Stockfish SF judges the position. So most of the positions are fairly balanced or a slight advantage to white, but the actual performance, you'll see that these are performances for black. Black scores reasonably well across most of these 14 examples which we're going to look at. It's really only example 10 which is it's kind of a dodgy Alekhine opening, which we'll see where black really significantly underperforms. So let's dive into the examples, and these are all saved as a study in Lichess, so I'll include the details for how you can access those. And the first one, if you look on the chapters on the left hand corner, GH, then we'll look at BA, HG and so on. So GH is coming from a Caro-Kann opening here, and white exchanges that knight. Not necessarily the most consequential move for white, but it might be tempting to double those pawns. And whilst those pawns may look weak, these two pawns here, certainly the back one can't move right now, and the forward one, it used to have, when it was on G7, it used to be able to capture two ways. Now it can only capture, well, it used to be able to move forward as well. Now it can only capture one way or move forwards. So that's an illustration of the reduction in possibilities for a double pawn. But what you might see is that this black bishop has an extra square it might come to. I mean, it might end up taking this pawn here, but conceivably it might come here and then have influence on these squares. And for the moment, the bishop is, there's a lot of arrows here, the bishop is defending the pawn on h6 quite nicely. So white may actually regret giving up the dark square bishop, because white may find that they're a bit weak on the dark squares. So that's a GH example. If we go on to the BA example, this is in some sense a mirror image, and this one's from a perch defense. And I make no claim that knight a6 is the strongest move here. White can take that, and obviously does in this example. Probably not the most consequential move. Pushing the pawn in the centre for white with e5 might be a stronger way of approaching things. And black recaptures, and once again you see, I mean, the two pawns are hard to manoeuvre maybe, so the back of one can't move, but the front one is nicely defended by the bishop, and it's not quite clear how how white would go about winning one of those pawns. Possibly a queen could come onto a square like this and take it at some point, but for the moment the bishop is defending that quite nicely. And in the meantime, black might put a rook on the b file, just as in the previous example the g file was open for black. So white may well be doing okay here, but the move exchanging the bishop for the knight wasn't necessarily that strong, and the double pawns aren't so weak here. Moving on to the HG example. This is from a Slav opening, and what you see here is a very common pattern in quite a few openings. White chases the bishop, judging that the bishop is worth a little bit more than the knight, so why not exchange it and inflict double pawns? And usually the way that the recapture works is that black recaptures towards the centre, and you can see immediately black has, without having to move the rook, has developed the rook onto a very nice active square. Now black castles king side, then that mobility will be reduced, but for the moment there's quite a bit of pressure on the h file, a little bit of pressure on the h2 pawn in some cases. You could envisage maybe a bishop coming onto this diagonal, or a queen onto this diagonal, and then lasering down on the h2 pawn in some cases. So the other thing is that the pawns are now more compact for black, so black's pawns are spread over 7 files rather than 8. And if black was trying to defend them in an ending with maybe a king or a short range piece like a knight, that could be a little bit easier to do. And in this case, in terms of creating passed pawns and so on, the two pawns here are holding up white's pawns quite nicely. So for the moment, there's no real big disadvantage from those double pawns. the reverse or the mirror image of this, the AB double pawns, you can see on this example here. And yeah, capturing on B4 is probably not the strongest move here. Black gets the double pawn, but just visually this pawn is quite irritating for white. It influences these two squares. In particular, this is a square that the white knight might like to move to, but obviously can't in the short term. So black is doing really quite nicely there, and the black rook is already influencing pressure there. So BC6 example is our next one. So this one comes from pretty standard king's pawn. White takes here, and D takes C6 may be more natural in terms of activating the bishop in some cases, but here white could then exchange queens. So the normal move is BC6, and here the pawns influence quite nicely in the centre here. Plenty of mobility on this pawn. The rook might come to the open file here at some point, but there is, in terms of squares that are weakened, if you think about in particular maybe the A5 square, then if you can imagine maybe a knight arriving there at some point, then that would be, black would be unable to attack that with a pawn, and that knight could be a little bit annoying attacking these kind of squares, and in particular the pawn on c6. So there is some weakness there, although there's a little bit more central control. The mirror image is a GF double pawn, and I mean here black could take both ways. We'll look at the other example later on. GF is capturing towards the centre, but there's similarly this square here might be a little bit weak for black in some cases, and you might imagine a knight going something like here, here, here. Even in some lines a queen might come to a square like this, and it would be difficult for black to influence that square. But in the meantime, this pawn influences the centre to a greater extent, and black may well be able to put a rook on the open line. So it's swings and roundabouts there. Next example, a CB example. So we had this position where black played A5, and then there was an AB trade, and here the exchange is generally seen as a little bit stronger for white. The pawn, black pawn, is dragged away from the centre, still influences these squares, but the black rook obviously doesn't get activated by this particular way of playing the Bogo Indian. And white has a greater possibility here of playing a move like A3 to try and open up the A file for white. The mirror of that is an FG trade. So this is quite a long opening example, has been in the past popular and at an elite level, the Slav opening. And we won't dwell on the detail of these, but we do end up in a position where white exchanges bishop for bishop, and you might think that, I mean, my gut reaction without knowing the theory on the position would be that HG would be a more natural capture, but in that case quite possibly this queen might come onto the H file, and there could be some nastiness going on H7. And also, if you did capture HG, then kicking that knight out of play, you obviously don't have an H pawn to do that, so if you move the F pawn, then that tends to weaken the E6 pawn as well. So if you want to get rid of the knight, then it makes sense to say with the f pawn, then you've got this move available to block the h file or to kick the knight, and you also have the possibility of putting a piece like a rook on the f file. So CD example. This is from a Dutch opening, and I mean normally in the Dutch, White's trying to control this square. So White's next move, it isn't the kind of the most critical move, because Black can recapture. Rather than recapturing with the queen, it makes more sense to recapture with the pawn, and then Black controls this normally weak square in the Dutch. Also influences this square, and Black's just got generally good control here. And then at some point the c file is probably open here, so that may also be useful. So that will be quite a nice exchange for Black. FE, this is the only really bad position that the double pawns get in these examples. This knight c6 is a risky move for Black. The other kinds is risky in itself, but the knight c6 is not the main move. The reason is that White can play in this way, sacrifice the pawn with e6. If Black recaptures with the bishop, then White has pawn to d5, forking the two pieces. So Black is really obliged to recapture with the pawn. Now Black has an extra pawn, but it is doubled. But it's less the doubling per se as the weakened king. Bad things may happen on this diagonal. The bishop finds it struggles to develop here. So it's just an awkward position for Black to finish developing. White has the possibility of bringing a knight here, either to recapture on e6 at some point, or to threaten squares like h7. The bishop may come to d3. You could imagine the queen, once a knight has moved, coming into a square like h5. And if Black does play a move like pawn to g6, then White could throw this h pawn up the board. So all in all, it's a very, very tricky position for Black. So DC example is, well, this is a very standard position. This is the Roy Lopez opening and the exchange variation, played from time to time by the likes of Bobby Fischer. And this is an example where White might hope to exchange all the pieces and in some sense win with an extra pass pawn in the ending, but there is quite a bit that needs to happen before we reach that point. And in practice, Black does quite nicely in this position. Black has two bishops and easy development for both of them, and White has a more classical non-double pawn structure, but Black should be fine here. Now we look at an EF example. This is one we saw before, where Black recaptured GF. Slightly solider is to recapture it with an EF, and this enables the bishop to develop easily. And this is a Trompowsky opening, and is actually quite a reasonable way for Black to develop. So a D example, another Dutch opening, fairly standard stuff, and then White recaptures. Not necessarily the best move, but here Black could recapture with either pawn. The one I put here just to illustrate a DE is this one here, and the pawn is doubled, but it does influence squares right in the middle of White's camp, and often, I mean the knight's almost certainly going to move here. White might want to try and exchange that with a move like f3 at some point. So because the pawn on e4 is the double pawn is really quite annoying. And then the final example we have here is a ED example and another Alekhine's opening and white exchanges. And to be honest, I mean, the most likely thing that's going to happen here is that black's going to play a move like pawn to d6 to try and get this bishop developed, and then the pawns, one way or another, will get exchanged. So it's probably only temporarily a pawn doubling. So those were the 14 different types. For the most part, the positions were fine. It was really only the Alekhine's example where the position is a bit ropey for the side with double pawns, and that's what we saw in the slides I showed earlier. It was example 10 where black scored actually less than 40% on the Lee chess games and just a little over 40% in the master database. So hopefully you've enjoyed those examples, given a little bit of context for double pawns. If you have any comments, please post them on the forum. And if you do like the videos, feel free to give it a like or even subscribe to the channel. And if you really like the videos, I did just publish a book called Better Chess Faster, which you can find on Amazon. So hopefully see you for the next video on the playing with double pawns.